Hello friends and welcome back to you. My name is Elizabeth and today I'm going to tell you 13 signs of amateur writing. Quick warning, when I was filming this video, the sun was outside my window going like this, and I did not realize it, and I don't know how to fix it, so be prepared for lighting that goes like this. So sorry. Now I'd like to start out by saying that any number of these 13 signs are likely to crop up in your first draft no matter how experienced of a writer you are. And that's fine, that's just the nature of first drafts. But in order to grow and improve as a writer, you need to be able to recognize when these things happen in your draft so that you can then revise them. And also, hopefully, avoid them happening in the future. Okay, so just because your novel is full of these signs of amateur writing doesn't mean that you're a bad writer. It might not even mean that you're an amateur writer. It just means that you now know where to focus during revision. Here we go. Top 13 signs of amateur writing. Number 1. Poorly used adverbs. Now, most people would probably say that an overuse of adverbs, or even any use of adverbs, would mark you as an amateur writer. But I'm not saying that, and here's why. When I was in college, I had a creative writing professor who explained adverbs as being a necessary component of the English language, otherwise we would not have them, but they are meant to be used to add something new to a sentence, and not to strengthen a weak verb or to add emotion to an otherwise bland sentence. And I remember that he used the example of the 1970 song Killing Me Softly with his song. The use of softly in that lyric is not only necessary because we don't have a word in the English language that means killing but make it soft. And it's also artistic because the juxtaposition of killing with softly is such a jarring shift in tone. That is how adverbs should be used, when they add something new to a sentence. I also allow myself to use adverbs willy-nilly during my first drafts, so that when I return to scenes during revision, I'm able to see the adverbs and be like, oh yeah, this scene was supposed to be angry. Let me rework it so that that comes across via word choice and character action, rather than having to leave, he said angrily, in the text. That just helps me move through first drafts more quickly, but to each his own, you know? So, adverbs are not the devil, but poorly used adverbs are a hallmark of amateur writing. Sign of amateur writing number 2. Stock characters. This is probably the single biggest thing that will drag your book down and mark you as an amateur writer. Pretty much any other mistake you can make while writing can be forgiven if your readers love your characters. They will follow a good character anywhere. But a generic stock character could go on the most interesting journey in history and still end up with a forgettable story. Even if you're a pantser, I highly encourage you to spend at least a little bit of time developing your characters before you start your first draft. It will save you a lot of work later. You don't need to know their goal or their backstory or their hair color or their favorite food, but you should at least identify what motivates them and what holds them back, i.e. their flaws, or at least their main flaw. That will just help you in all your scenes. It will help you when you inevitably get stuck halfway through your first draft, because rather than trying to force a stock character through your plot, you'll be able to step back and think, okay, what motivates this character? And what holds them back? If they're motivated by justice, they'll make very different choices than if they're motivated by revenge, or monetary gain, or saving their sister. If they're hot-tempered or reckless, they'll make very different choices than if they're apathetic or cautious. Do you see how that will dictate how they move throughout your story? And what choices they'll make to get from point A to point B in your story? Flat, stock characters can be useful when you're just getting ideas out onto the page, but when you're actually making choices that will propel your story in a certain direction, you really need to understand your characters enough to know what motivates them and what holds them back. Otherwise, they will always feel generic and unmemorable. Complex character, like Tony Stark, for example, was obnoxious and selfish until they are forced to survive, and then through that survival not only grows internally, but is also able to view themselves from the outside in for the first time in their life, and see how their own flaws led to their downfall. That kind of complex character work and development is much more interesting and memorable than someone who's just bopping along in their life and then gets struck by a meteor and then suddenly has superpowers, with no real driving goal or stakes in the story. Sign of amateur writing number 3. Boring word choice. As a writer, you probably hear a lot about the importance of interesting verbs in order to save you from using less interesting adjectives and adverbs, and that is true. But boring word choice is not just for verbs. It's for everything, for all your words. If your story sounds like it could have been written for hire, as in anyone could have written it, then you probably want to go back through and liven up your word choice a little bit. Add more of you. Your voice as a writer is as much about word choice as it is about sentence structure or story progression. Play with words, learn new words, seek words out. Your writing will benefit from it. Amateur writing sign number 4. Generic description. I've said it before and I'll say it again. My favorite quote about writing description comes from Neil Gaiman, and that is, you can take for granted that people know more or less what a street, a shop, a beach, a sky, an oak tree look like. Tell them what makes this one different. If your scenes all take place in generic kitchens or taverns or castles, or woods or forests, or classrooms, then there's nothing memorable for your reader to hang on to. There's nothing to get immersed in. The best way to avoid this problem is to focus on small, specific details rather than the space as a whole. Don't say the characters are in a kitchen. Say that they're standing beside a yellowed fridge that always carries the faint scent of rot no matter how many times they clean it. Just any small, specific detail about the space to help bring it to life in your reader's mind. This also holds true for character description. No matter what kind of story you're writing, you never want to have just a whole bunch of generic, attractive people walking around being your characters. Not only is that not interesting or memorable, but it also removes a level of realness that unique and vivid imagery can add to your novel. Generically described characters are one more thing that can make your novel feel like a novel and not like a shared experience the reader is involved in. Basically, there's no place on earth besides fiction and TikTok where everyone is equally attractive. You don't want that to be your novel. Even if you're writing a romance, it's much more interesting to have the love interest be an actual human-looking character who you've spent the time developing into a complex character. Someone charming and attractive, interesting and seductive, rather than some generic muscle man with no real personality. More human and complex character can actually increase the fantasy feelings of your romance novel, because then that character feels so real and memorable to your readers that they feel like it could actually be someone that they could dream up and meet in their real life. Do you see? Amateur writing sign number 5. Ostentatious metaphors. Ostentatious does not necessarily mean pretentious metaphors or overly convoluted metaphors. It simply means metaphors that draw too much attention to themselves. Usually this happens because the author stuck in a metaphor that they thought sounded good, even though it has no purpose being in the story. Unless you're writing from an omniscient narrator, the language that you use in the narration should still be in your character's voice, whether you're writing in first person or third person. So, metaphors about life and death and eternity might not be appropriate for the voice of a 10-year-old, or metaphors that refer to classic literature might not work for a rough and tumble truck driver unless a love of literature is an established part of his character. Does that make sense? If your metaphor is coming from you, the writer, and not the voice of the character, it will usually feel out of place and call attention to itself. And the readers will recognize it as a voice of the writer and not as a natural part of the story. And that's no good, you don't want that. Amateur writing sign number 6. Repeated scenes. This is also a problem for experienced writers because it can be very difficult to tell whether or not your scenes have unique purposes, unless you specifically go through your story after drafting and identify the purpose of each scene in order to make sure that you aren't repeating unnecessary moments. For example, you might have a scene where 2 characters work on a project together and it establishes their friendship. Then you might have a scene of the 2 characters driving somewhere together, like on a road trip, and it establishes their friendship. Then you might have a scene of 2 characters telling secrets to each other, and it establishes their friendship. Do you see the problem? All those scenes have the same purpose, so it starts to feel really repetitive for your readers. You want to make sure each scene serves a new and interesting purpose. Maybe one scene has the characters meet, and that scene is used to establish their differing personalities or goals as a way to set up conflict for later. Then you might have another scene of them working together to solve a problem, or one character comforting the other character, in order to show that both characters are willing to put aside their differences in order to make their friendship work. And then that scene establishes their friendship. You just have to make sure that each scene with the 2 characters has a new purpose in the story. A new purpose. And so then all their scenes together are not just one scene after another of establishing friendship. You have one scene establishing friendship, and that's it. Amateur writing sign number 7. No conflict. An easy way to identify amateur writing is by reading a story and just being constantly bored. You might not be able to articulate why the story is boring, but you know that you're bored. And that makes it feel amateurish because you know you aren't in the hands of a master storyteller. And the main reason that stories feel boring is because nothing happens. There is no conflict. No tension between the characters, no tension within the characters. No one is struggling with internal struggles or dilemmas. There aren't any external obstacles to overcome. No one wants anything enough to make active choices in their lives. The characters are all just kind of chilling. Maybe they're working on projects for work, or chatting to their new boyfriend about their job, or hanging out with their friends. And it's just not interesting. As a new writer, it can be hard to tell when your scenes are lacking conflict and are not interesting because you, the writer, you love your characters, and you think your readers will love your characters, and will be willing to sit with them while they all just chill. But that is an erroneous assumption. That love from the readers has to be earned. They won't love your characters just because you do. Readers need something to root for. They need to see characters struggling and yearning and making choices, and mistakes and sacrifices in pursuit of their goal. That is how you earn the right to relax at a bar with your characters. It can't just be an automatic part of your story. Amateur writing sign number 8. Your story is too preachy. A lot of people start writing because they have something to say. And that's great. That's a great reason to start writing. But if you don't spend the time needed to learn how to develop characters and propel a story the way real people propel their lives, then your stories will always end up feeling like parables. Like something a child might be taught in Sunday school in order to learn how to behave. And when people read books like that, it tends to put their backs up because nobody wants to be preached to in a book. They don't want to be taught. They want to see and experience real people struggling and striving in their real lives, no matter how fantastical those lives might be. And then through those stories and struggles, the reader, along with the character, gets to decide what the meaning of the struggle is and what emotional truth they want to take from the story. You won't get that if it's shoved down their throat by you, the writer. Sign of amateur writing number 9. Your story has no theme. This is sort of the opposite of being preachy. A story with no theme is a story that doesn't say anything. It has no purpose. It's just words meandering around the loose shape of a story. Loose shape of a story. There's nothing for you to grab your emotions, for you to remember it by, for you to puzzle around in your mind. A story with no theme will go in one ear and out the other. These will be the books that you forget to even add to the list of books that you read during a year because you forgot that you read it as soon as you were done reading it. A theme can be retroactively added to a story, but it's best to set the scene for theme to develop on its own by creating characters with conflicting beliefs or goals and then have those characters interact. That's where theme comes from. Not just fighting for the sake of fighting, but allowing room for multiple sides of any belief to be explored in the story. Amateur writing sign number 10. Clumsy exposition. Hey John, my oldest brother, how was your day working at the cranberry farm? No one talks like that. That is the world's clumsiest exposition disguised as dialogue. Exposition in dialogue is almost always boring for your reader and should be revised, but that is especially true if both characters already know what is being said. Like one character announcing the other character as his oldest brother. Don't do that. That is always a no-go. Not almost always, always. If you have two characters greeting each other with their own personal bios attached, then you need to revise. That's just how it is. The second major way that amateur writers clumsily include exposition in their novels is by having massive paragraphs of exposition, especially at the starts of scenes or at the start of your novel as a whole. I call them word breaks. You always want to try to avoid word breaking. Okay, exposition is important, the story needs it, the readers need it in order to be grounded in the story. But if you find yourself including exposition via dialogue or word breaks, then just remember, there's gotta be a better way. Amateur writing sign number 11. Awkward dialogue. Exposition is not the only way that you can bog down your dialogue. There's approximately 1 million ways to mess up dialogue, and every time you write a new book, you will learn new ways. Dialogue is hard. It's hard to write. It's hard to get right. Several of the types of awkward dialogue that amateur writers might be using to bog down their story and mark them as amateurs include melodramatic or overly emotional dialogue, boring, roundabout dialogue that doesn't add anything new to a scene, overly obtuse dialogue that is trying so hard to be subtle that it ends up just reading as meandering, or dialogue that relies on character tropes and archetypes for the basics of its structure and word choice, rather than on actually developed character personality. There are just many, many ways that dialogue can sound awkward, but when it does, the whole book feels amateurish even if everything else is fine. Sign of amateur writing number 12. Too much internal narration. Character musing almost never adds to a story, and can almost always be cut. To readers, long paragraphs of characters musing inside their heads usually feels like filler, no matter how interesting the word choices happen to be, like a way for the author to pass the time before something interesting happens again. It's just not necessary. Authors usually add large sections of internal musing when they are not confident in their ability to convey their characters' thoughts and emotions through scene and dialogue. But if you come upon a point of a large amount of internal narration in your story, it's a good sign that you need to rework the actual scenes surrounding the narration so that you make sure that you are conveying your character's emotions and also the important information that readers need to take from the scene without needing to fall back on internal narration and musing. Just something to keep in mind. Amateur writing sign number 13. An overly familiar story and characters. This is pretty much the biggest problem that amateur writers face in their story, because it is a fundamental problem. And that is that they write stories and characters that they like and have sort of just plucked from other stories, usually their favorite stories, and are now just moving them around in slightly new scenes. Whenever anything is overly familiar, that is when it becomes a cliche. And that's actually how I like to think of cliches in my writing, because it can be kind of hard to understand and identify what a cliche is just based solely off of the word cliche. But if you replace the word cliche in your head with anything overly familiar, then it becomes much easier to identify them in your writing. Try to think, is this story both new and original and also built around the specific motivations of these characters? Or is the plot just a plot that you like and you just stuck it in this book because that's what books need? Are your characters uniquely crafted people with desires and flaws and backstory that propel the story forward to its original conclusion through the choices that they make? Or are they just stock characters that you're moving around in familiar ways? Like the wounded hero, the funny sidekick, or the maniacal villain. Starting out with stock characters can be a great way to begin creating the characters for your story. But if you don't flesh them out to complete people, then they will never feel like real people to your readers. And then, ultimately, your characters and your story will end up being forgettable.